Okay, let's unpack this. How do we really know if a medical treatment works? I mean, truly know it's the thing causing the improvement, not just chance or something else.
Right. That's the core question.
And for decades, the undisputed champion for answering that has been the randomized controlled trial, the RCT.
The gold standard.
That's what it calls it. But lately, maybe you've noticed, there's this enormous wave of data washing over healthcare, information from electronic records, from insurance claims.
Even from things like smartwatches, wearables.
Exactly. And that's giving rise to this powerful new approach using what we call real-world data.
Yeah, RWD. And it's created this fascinating tension. Sometimes it's even framed as a kind of clash,
Yeah.
The old way versus the new data-rich way.
People are asking, is the gold standard still the gold standard?
Or is it becoming obsolete?
And that's exactly the deep dive we're taking today. We're not here to pick a side or declare a winner.
No, not at all.
But to truly understand what makes each of these approaches unique, where they shine, where they fall short, and maybe most importantly, how they are increasingly working together.
Because the future of understanding medical interventions, it isn't really about choosing one over the other.
Right.
It's about recognizing their distinct strengths and leveraging them in a really smart, integrated way. It's about building a much richer, more complete picture of how treatments actually perform.
Not just in a controlled lab setting, but for you, the actual patient out there.
Exactly.
So, welcome. Understanding medical evidence might sound a bit intimidating, maybe complex.
It can seem that way.
But stick with us. We're going to guide you through it, making sense of this evolving landscape. Let's jump in.
Okay. So, to appreciate the shift, we really have to start with the foundation, the long-standing champion, the randomized controlled trial, or RCT. For a very long time, this has been the way regulatory bodies and researchers evaluated if a new drug or device worked and if it was safe.
The standard we build everything on, basically.
Pretty much.
And what gives it that gold standard status? It seems to come down to a few core design principles that are, pretty ingenious.
They really are. At its heart, it's an experiment. And the most critical element, the absolute key, is randomization.
Okay.
So imagine you have a group of patients who qualify for a study, instead of a doctor deciding who gets what.
Which could introduce bias.
Right. A computer essentially assigns them randomly, like flipping a coin, but, on a massive scale in different groups.
So one group might get the treatment being tested.
The intervention group. Yeah.
And the other, the control group, they might get a placebo, like a sugar pill.
Sometimes a placebo, yes. Or maybe they get the current standard treatment that's already available. Or sometimes, depending on the situation, maybe just supportive care, not an active drug.
Okay.
And that randomization, it's magic for researchers.
Right, yeah.
It aims to balance out everything between those groups right at the start.
Everything. Like what?
Well, known factors like age, gender, how severe their disease is, but also things we don't know about or can't easily measure. Unknown confounders.
Ah.
The goal is just to make the groups as similar as humanly possible, so the only significant difference, ideally, is whether they got the new treatment or not.
So you minimize bias right from the get-go. You're trying to isolate that one variable, the treatment.
Precisely. You got it. And having that control group is absolutely non-negotiable if you want to establish cause and effect.
Right. You need something to compare against.
Exactly. If the group getting the treatment improves, you need that control group to show the improvement wasn't just, the placebo effect.
Or people just getting better on their own over time.
Or other care they were receiving anyway.
Yeah.
The control group lets you say with more confidence, yes, it looks like the treatment actually did this.
Okay, that makes sense. And what about blinding? I've heard that term thrown around with clinical trials.
Yes. Another crucial bias minimization technique. Very important.
How does that work?
Well, in a single blind study, the participants, the patients, they don't know which group they're in, treatment or control.
Okay.
In a double-blind study, which is even stronger, neither the participants nor the researchers interacting with them or assessing their outcomes, none of them know who's getting what.
Wow. Okay.
Not until the study is completely finished and the code is broken.
And why is that so important?
It prevents expectations or, preconceived notions from influencing things, like how patients report their symptoms or how researchers interpret potentially subjective results, keeps it more objective.
Fascinating. So randomization, control groups, blinding. And you also mentioned before there are very strict rules about who can even participate, right? The criteria.
Yes, very strict inclusion and exclusion criteria. Trials are incredibly selective about who they enroll.
Why so selective?
Well, partly it's for patient safety,
Yeah.
but it also helps create a study population that's relatively homogeneous, similar in key ways.
Which makes it easier to see the effect.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Makes it easier to see the specific effect of the intervention without a lot of noise or variability from other patient factors muddying the waters.
Okay, so layering all those principles together, the randomization, control, blinding, strict criteria, what's the ultimate power of the RCT? What's the core reason it's been the standard for so long?
It really boils down to what researchers call high internal validity.
Internal validity, meaning?
Meaning that within the carefully controlled world of that specific study, you can be very confident that the results are accurate. And critically, that the intervention caused the outcome you observed.
So it's incredibly good at proving cause and effect, but maybe just in that specific setting.
That's a good way to put it. It's our best tool for isolating the treatment effect and minimizing the risk of confounding.
Confounding, that's when other factors confuse the picture.
Exactly. Where other factors, not the treatment, might be responsible for the outcome. Randomization is the best way we know to distribute those confounders, known and unknown, evenly between the groups. And this ability to establish causality with such high certainty is precisely why regulatory bodies like the FDA in the US or the EMA in Europe have historically required multiple successful RCTs before they approve a new drug or medical device for widespread use.
It gives them confidence that this thing actually works.
And is reasonably safe, yes.
But, as we hinted, nothing's perfect, especially in the messy world of human health.
Definitely not.
And it's the limitations of RCTs that have really opened the door for other forms of evidence to gain ground. So where do they fall short?
Well, first off, they are notoriously expensive and time-consuming, really resource-intensive.
How expensive are we talking?
We can be talking years, often a decade or more, from the initial research to getting an approval. And the costs can run into the hundreds of millions, sometimes even billions of dollars for a single successful drug development program.
Wow. That's a huge barrier.
It is. And then there's that point you made about the strict inclusion criteria.
Right, the selectiveness.
That leads to a really big limitation. Limited generalizability, sometimes called external validity.
Meaning the results might not apply to everyone.
Exactly. The patients in the trials are often much younger, generally healthier overall. They often have fewer coexisting conditions, fewer other illnesses, and they might not represent the full diversity, age, ethnicity, health status of the real patient population who will eventually use the drug if it's approved.
So it works great in the trial participants, but maybe not so well in, say, my grandpa who has 3 other health problems.
That's the concern. This creates what's often called the efficacy-effectiveness gap.
Okay, break that down. Efficacy versus effectiveness.
Efficacy is how well a treatment works under the ideal controlled conditions of an RCT, pure environment. Effectiveness is how well it works out in the messy real world.
Right.
For that broader range of patients with their other health issues, maybe they're taking 5 other medications, maybe they don't always take the drug exactly as prescribed.
Real life, basically.
Real life. An RCT might show something has high efficacy, but you don't truly know its real-world effectiveness until it's used much more widely.
And because trials usually have a set time frame, maybe a year or 2,
Sometimes longer, but yeah, they have an endpoint.
they can struggle to capture long-term effects, right? Or detect really rare side effects.
Absolutely. Side effects that only show up after many years of use, or that only affect, say, 1 in 10,000 people, are very likely to be missed in a trial with only a few thousand participants studied for a limited time.
That makes sense.
Plus, the whole trial environment itself. Patients get lots of attention, close monitoring, maybe free medication, improving adherence. It just doesn't always reflect how that treatment will actually be used day to day in routine clinical practice.
By different doctors in different hospitals with different levels of patient support.
All those real-world variables. So while RCTs are incredibly powerful for proving that initial cause and effect link,
They don't give you the whole picture of real-world impact.
not always, no.
And that's where the conversation really shifts, doesn't it? With this explosion of data we mentioned, we're seeing this other approach rise to prominence. Real-world data.
Absolutely. This is the formidable counterpart, maybe, to the RCT,
Right.
driven by just the sheer volume of digital health information that's now available.
So break it down for us. What exactly is real-world data? RWD, and then there's RWD, real-world evidence. What's the difference?
Good question. Think of RWD, real-world data, as basically data that's collected during routine healthcare delivery or, everyday life. It's data collected outside of a structured clinical trial setting.
Okay. Like what specifically?
Well, huge amounts come from electronic health records, EHRs. The notes your doctor takes, your lab results, diagnoses.
The stuff in my patient portal.
Pretty much.
Huh.
Also, data from insurance claims, billing codes tell you about diagnoses, procedures, medications filled. Then there are things like disease registries that track specific conditions.
Yeah.
And increasingly, patient-generated health data from wearable devices, fitness trackers, health apps, even potentially social media, though that's more complex.
So it's just the digital footprint of healthcare and health activity as it actually happens out there.
That's a great way to put it. It's observational data. You're observing what's happening, not intervening like in a trial.
Okay, so that's RWD. What's RWE then?
RWE, real-world evidence, is the clinical evidence you generate when you take that raw RWD and apply rigorous analytical methods to it.
Ah, so you analyze the data.
Right. You analyze the RWD to generate insights or conclusions about the usage or the benefits or the risks of medical products, drugs, devices, diagnostics. RWD is the raw material. RW is the evidence built from analyzing it.
Got it. RWD is the data. RWE is the insight from the data. What makes this approach so compelling? What are the big strengths here?
Okay, the absolute biggest strength, the main selling point, is its ability to show real-world effectiveness.
Back to that gap we talked about.
Exactly. RWE can tell you how treatments actually perform in the diverse, everyday practice setting, often including those very patients who are likely excluded from the strict RCTs.
Like the elderly, kids, pregnant women, people with multiple chronic conditions, people taking lots of other meds.
All those groups. RWE helps bridge that efficacy-effectiveness gap. It shows performance in action.
For a much wider group of people.
A much wider, more representative group. And the scalability is just enormous.
How so?
Well, instead of enrolling, say, hundreds or maybe a few thousand patients for a specific trial, which takes time and effort, you can potentially analyze existing data sets covering hundreds of thousands or even millions of patients relatively quickly.
Once the data is accessible and usable anyway.
Right. There are data challenges we'll get to. But the potential scale makes it much quicker and potentially less expensive to generate certain types of insights compared to launching a whole new RCT.
Which also means broader generalizability, I guess.
Absolutely. Because you're looking at such large, diverse populations, the findings from RWE are often more directly applicable to the general patient population. You see a vast range of demographics, different disease stages, different ways doctors practice across the country or even the world.
And because these data sources like EHRs or claims often go back many years.
That's another huge advantage. RWD is invaluable for long-term follow-up and detecting rare events.
The things RCTs often miss.
Precisely. If a serious side effect only occurs in, say, 1 out of 50,000 people, an RCT with a few thousand participants followed for 2 years will almost certainly miss it.
But RWD tracking millions over longer periods
is much, much better equipped to spot that kind of safety signal over time. This is absolutely critical for things like post-market safety surveillance monitoring drugs after they've been approved.
Makes sense. And you mentioned patient-generated data.
Yes. Increasingly, RWD sources can capture things like patient-reported outcomes, PROs, data directly from patients about their symptoms, their quality of life, their daily functioning.
So not just clinical measurements, but how the treatment actually impacts the patient's experience.
Exactly, which is incredibly valuable and often missing from traditional trials.
Okay, so RWD sounds pretty amazing, lots of potential, but it can't be all sunshine and roses. What are the downsides, the limitations?
Oh, absolutely. It's crucial to be realistic. RWD has significant limitations, and its Achilles heel, really, compared to RCTs, is its inherent susceptibility to confounding and bias.
Because you're not controlling anything, right? You're just observing what happened naturally.
Exactly, it didn't randomize. So the biggest challenge is something called confounding by indication.
Confounding by indication, what does that mean?
It means that the reason a patient received a particular treatment might be related to their underlying health status or prognosis. For example, sicker patients might be more likely to receive a newer, perhaps more aggressive treatment.
Okay.
So if you just naively compare the outcomes of patients on the new treatment versus an older one, it might look like the new treatment is less effective or even harmful.
When really it's just that the sicker people got it in the first place.
Precisely. The difference in outcome could be due to those baseline differences in the patients themselves, not the treatment effect. Untangling that is really hard.
I see. That sounds like a major pitfall. It's hard to know if the treatment made the difference or if it was because the people who got the treatment were already different in some important way.
That's the core challenge of observational research. And besides confounding by indication, you can also face other issues like selection bias.
Mm.
Maybe the patients whose data is available in a certain database aren't representative of everyone with the condition. Or information bias.
Meaning the data itself isn't accurate.
Yeah, or is recorded inconsistently. Think about it. RWD is often collected primarily for clinical care or billing, not specifically for research.
Right, doctors are busy treating patients, not filling out perfect research forms.
Exactly. So the data can be messy. There can be missing information, inaccuracies, inconsistencies in how things are coded across different hospitals or clinics. Definitely major variability and data quality challenges. Garbage in, garbage out can be a real concern if you're not careful.
And getting different systems to even talk to each other must be tough, too. Like Hospital A's system and Hospital B's system.
Oh, absolutely. Lack of standardization and interoperability issues are huge technical hurdles. Trying to pool and analyze RWD from multiple different sources with different formats and coding systems is a massive undertaking.
Okay. And the causality piece. Can RWE actually prove cause and effect like an RCT?
That's the other major limitation. Because it's observational, while you can often show strong associations between a treatment and an outcome.
Correlation, not necessarily causation.
Exactly. It is significantly harder to establish direct causality with the same level of certainty as a well-conducted RCT. You need very sophisticated statistical methods, things like propensity score matching or instrumental variable analysis to try and mimic randomization and control for confounding.
But even those aren't perfect.
They help a lot, but they can't always completely eliminate the possibility of unmeasured confounding factors you didn't know about or couldn't adjust for. So establishing definitive cause and effect is tougher.
And of course, using all the sensitive patient data must raise privacy concerns.
Huge ones. Privacy and ethical considerations are paramount. Handling RWD requires meticulous attention to de-identification, data security, governance, and patient consent where applicable. It's a really critical piece.
So understanding these strengths and weaknesses on both sides, the high internal validity but maybe lower generalizability of RCTs versus the high generalizability but confounding risks of RWD, that's really the key to seeing the bigger picture, isn't it?
It really is. Yeah. Which brings us right back to the central question we started with. Are RCTs obsolete in this age of big data and RWD?
And based on everything we've discussed, and really the direction the whole field is heading, the answer seems to be a clear and definitive no.
Absolutely not. They are not being replaced.
Yeah.
What we're seeing instead is a really powerful synergistic integration.
Synergy, yeah.
RWD and RCTs are becoming indispensable complementary forces. They work together.
How does RWD help make RCTs better then? How does that synergy work?
Well, in several really interesting ways. For one, RWD can be incredibly valuable in informing trial design before an RCT even gets off the ground.
How so?
By analyzing existing real-world data, researchers can get a much better handle on the natural progression of a disease in the population. They can identify which patient subgroups are most likely to benefit from a new treatment. They can use RWD to refine the inclusion and exclusion criteria for the trial, maybe making them a bit broader and more relevant to real-world practice from the start. They can select the most meaningful outcomes to measure things that actually matter to patients based on RWD insights.
And even figure out if they can actually find enough patients for the trial.
Yes. Assess recruitment feasibility. Basically using real-world insights to design smarter, more efficient, and more relevant clinical trials.
That makes a lot of sense, using the real world to improve the experiment.
Precisely. And RWD is also enabling some really innovative trial designs, like the use of synthetic control arms, sometimes called external control arms.
Synthetic control arms, what's that?
So instead of enrolling a whole group of patients into a traditional placebo or standard of care control group within the RCT.
Which takes time and resources and sometimes raises ethical questions.
Exactly. You can potentially use historical RWD from similar patients who received the standard care in the recent past, outside the trial, to create a virtual or synthetic control group for comparison against the group getting the new treatment in the trial.
Wow. So you might not need a separate concurrent control group in the actual trial itself.
In certain situations, yes.
That sounds like a potential game changer. Especially, like you said, for rare diseases where finding enough patients for two arms is incredibly difficult.
It can be. Or for certain conditions, maybe in oncology, where Using a placebo might be ethically challenging if an effective treatment already exists. It can potentially accelerate studies and make trials feasible in situations where they might not have been before.
Interesting. What else?
RWD also helps facilitate pragmatic clinical trials.
Pragmatic trials.
These are trials specifically designed to test interventions in more real-world clinical settings, often embedded within routine healthcare delivery. They aim to directly address that efficacy-effectiveness gap by seeing how things work under usual care conditions. RWD helps identify sites and patients for these trials and collect outcomes data more efficiently.
So blurring the lines a bit between trial and practice.
In a carefully designed way, yes. And then, of course, once a treatment is approved, often based largely on those rigorous RCTs.
RWD becomes essential for post-market surveillance, right? Keeping an eye on it long term.
Absolutely critical. It provides that ongoing, long-term monitoring for safety, signals those rare side effects, and confirms the effectiveness in the much larger, more diverse population that uses the drug after approval. RWD lets us track performance over years, even decades.
The initial trial is really just the starting point.
It is.
Okay, so RWD clearly enhances RCTs. What about the other way around? How do RCTs help us make sense of all this RWD and RWE?
Well, the RCT provides that initial, crucial benchmark. It establishes the causal link. Does this thing actually work under ideal conditions? And gives us a measure of its efficacy.
The baseline truth, kind of?
Kind of, yeah. The high certainty starting point.
Mm-hmm.
So when you then generate RWE, showing how the treatment performs differently in the real world, maybe it seems less effective, or maybe surprisingly more effective in some subgroup.
Mm-hmm.
That initial RCT data gives you the essential context to understand why. Is it because of differences in the patients? Is it how doctors are prescribing it? Are patients not taking it correctly in the real world? Are other medications interfering?
So the RCT helps you interpret the RWE and understand the real-world variables that are at play.
Exactly. It provides that reference point.
Yeah.
And regulatory agencies like the FDA and ENA are increasingly recognizing this whole integrated picture.
How are they adapting?
Their frameworks, especially with updates around, say, 2025 and onwards, are clearly outlining specific instances where RW generated from RWD is acceptable, even encouraged, for regulatory decision-making.
So they're formally accepting RWE now.
For certain uses, yes. While RCTs definitely remain the gold standard required for the initial approval of most completely novel therapies.
Where you need that highest level of certainty.
Right. RWE is increasingly being used for things like supporting label expansions, getting a drug approved for a new use or a different patient population based on real-world performance.
Mm-hmm.
Also for fulfilling post-marketing study requirements mandated at the time of initial approval.
Okay.
And sometimes, particularly in areas like rare diseases, where conducting traditional RCTs is extremely difficult or maybe impossible, RWE might even serve as part of the primary evidence package supporting an approval alongside other data.
So it's definitely not about choosing one over the other anymore.
Not at all.
It's about using the strengths of each where they are most powerful and ideally using them together to get the full story.
That's exactly right. Each methodology truly shines in different scenarios. It's about the right tool for the right question.
So let's summarize that. Where are RCTs still basically irreplaceable?
Okay, indispensable for establishing the initial efficacy and safety of entirely novel interventions, brand new drugs, first-in-class devices where you need the absolute highest possible certainty about cause and effect before exposing large populations.
Makes sense.
They're essential for highly controlled comparisons needed to isolate very specific effects and minimize bias when that clear, unambiguous signal is paramount for approval.
Okay. And where does RWD generating RWE really excel? Where does it shine?
Well, as we said, definitely post-market safety, surveillance, pharmacovigilance, tracking those rare or long-term side effects across millions of users. That's a huge one.
Right.
Also, comparative effectiveness research, or CER. This is huge. Using RWE to see how different already approved treatments stack up against each other in routine clinical practice. Which one worked better with patients in the real world? RCTs comparing head-to-head sometimes don't get done or don't reflect real use.
So helping doctors and patients choose between existing options.
Exactly. RWE is also vital for studying rare diseases, where enrolling enough patients for an RCT is often just not feasible. RWD lets you pool data on the few patients that exist across many centers.
Mm-hmm.
It's great for understanding the natural history and burden of disease in diverse populations. How common is it? Who gets it? How does it progress without intervention? Also for generating hypotheses, spotting patterns in RWD that researchers can then go on to test with more controlled methods. maybe even an RCT.
So RWD can spark new research questions?
Definitely. And for exploring long-term outcomes well beyond the typical duration of a clinical trial. And finally, for assessing the real-world impact of health policies or changes to the healthcare system itself.
Yeah.
Did a new guideline change practice? Did a reimbursement change affect outcomes?
You can see those broader effects in the population data.
Right. Things an RCT typically isn't designed to measure.
Okay, so circling back one last time to that big overarching question, are traditional clinical trials, RCTs, becoming obsolete?
The answer is a resounding no. Emphatically no. But are they staying the same? Absolutely not. They are evolving dramatically.
The RCT remains our cornerstone, maybe, for proving that initial efficacy and causality under ideal conditions. It's still the champion for that specific crucial purpose.
It is. But the rise of real-world data and the real-world evidence derived from it provides that absolutely crucial real-world context, the scalability, the long-term perspective that RCTs often can't deliver on their own.
So the future isn't RCT or RWE, it's RCT and RWE.
Precisely. The most robust, the most reliable, the most useful evidence moving forward will increasingly come from this blended approach. From a comprehensive evidence ecosystem that thoughtfully integrates the unique strengths of both RCTs and RWD.
Often in innovative hybrid study designs, we're only just starting to explore fully.
Exactly. It's really about painting the most complete picture possible from the high-certainty, tightly controlled environment of a trial, all the way through to the complex, messy reality of everyday healthcare delivery and patient experience.
And understanding this evolution and how we generate evidence, well, it ultimately leads to more informed decisions by doctors, by regulators, by patients, and hopefully better health outcomes for all of us.
That's the goal.
It's a really fascinating and, frankly, exciting time in health research because we just have more tools in the toolbox than ever before.
We do. More data, more methods, more potential for insight.
So a final thought for you listening. Considering how medical information is generated and validated is changing so rapidly, even compared to just a decade ago, how might you think differently about where you get your health information or perhaps how you assess its reliability in the future? Something to ponder.